The session really is around what sustainable and responsible communication is, and the implications for small and medium-sized enterprises. You notice I've put sustainable and responsible, and throughout I will be using them interchangeably. There is a slight difference between the two, of course, and one implies a more ethical communication than the other, and the other implies a more sort of long-term ability to survive, basically. The market prefers responsible. So people prefer hearing about responsible. Sustainable seems to have a certain amount of resistance. So in your communication, it's better to stress responsible. But of course, I am talking about communication about sustainability. So use the term responsible, I would suggest, but I wanted you to understand that we are actually talking about sustainable communication too. And so that white paper just talks a little bit about what responsible communication is and why it matters for engaging consumers. We've tried to make it short. It comes from our research, but not just our research amongst people in Leicestershire, which is one element of what we've been doing, but also a review of lots of campaigns and the literature, the academic literature, which talks about this extensively. Really, why does let's call it responsible communication matter? And the reason responsible communication matters is because customers really want to hear authenticity. They want to hear messages that they can believe, that are credible. So they do expect honesty. Greenwashing risks this kind of deep skepticism and disengagement. To do this, it's not a case of just putting your policy into practice and then just communicating it and leaving it at that. You've got to move with your key audiences. You've got to be calibrating your communication so that it does hit the mark, and that requires you to not just speak but to listen. But it matters to SMEs for a number of reasons, really. And these are as follows: that it can be a way of differentiating yourself from everybody else. It can be a unique selling point if you get this right, and not everybody's doing the same sort of thing, and you genuinely do what you say you will do. You may think, well, some may think, well, it's difficult because I'm a small business, but actually that's not necessarily the case. There are examples of small businesses that have shown sustainable communication. One of the most successful chocolate bars in the marketplace is Tony's Chocolonely. Amazingly cutting through, a lot of young people buying Tony's Chocolonely because of its credentials, the fact that they pay more to their suppliers, it's free trade and so on. And the Roberts Travel Group, not part of their messaging until they launched an electric bus, and that electric bus drove quite strong interest, but struggling to communicate sustainability across different services because they've not necessarily got the right kind of offer to be able to do that. And their problem was they lacked expertise to explain things like zero emissions and carbon neutral. But I think the reason why they struggle to explain those is because people don't want to hear those terms, really. When we've talked and looked at the literature on to businesses on what's stopping them adopting sustainability principles, then we hear of barriers, but we also hear of enablers, and the two are not quite the same thing, but they're similar. Yes, these are perceived barriers, not necessarily real barriers. Having said that, it doesn't really matter whether it's perceived or real. What matters is that in the end, that barrier is overcome. But and if it's perceived, then it's explained that it's not real, and if it's real, then it's circumvented. Support from the supply and demand network, basically the supply chain. So supply chain's pushing to do this as an enabler. Not all these companies are small, of course. I'm naming some larger companies occasionally, partly because I think it's useful to do so because they're better known cases. But H&M, the Swedish company, the Swedish clothes company, faced a greenwashing backlash because of its poor communications, basically. Having an impact on their consumers means a significant decline in sales. The impact for a small enterprise is probably worse if you think about it. And the reason it's probably worse is because we all know the statistics about the survivability of small firms. It's hard surviving beyond 5 years for a small firm. So when you are able to do it, you're an exceptional small firm in many ways. And anything that takes away your sales and reputation is deeply worrying. It's useful to think about who, what, why, and how you're messaging. As far as what's concerned, your message, outline your sustainability or responsibility goals, what you're doing, what your practices are, what certifications you have and partnerships. And I can hear a number of you applying for 14001, which makes a lot of sense. What products and services are sustainable, and your community engagement. I think this community engagement aspect is fundamental. I think it's how SMEs will win every day over large companies. And in a sense, customers need a different message from employees, and employees need a different message from the local community. Working out how to speak to the local community wasn't easy, because a football club can have enormous problems with its local community if it doesn't get that, things like noise and light pollution, and of course riotous or antisocial behaviour. So you've got those three concerns. So I think your local community, depending on the type of firm you are, your local community can be really important. What's the value of doing this stuff? You're trying to address queries and complaints, perhaps, but you're also trying to educate your customers, engage your employees so that they're more ready to work with the firm, and hopefully for a longer period of time, and comply with regulations and earn some legitimacy. So responsible communication works best when it's interactive, when it's framed effectively, when it's authentic. In other words, it's meant, really. When it's not overly preachy, balanced head and heart, so-called, and when it's focused on the right kind of content. Now, it's not easy to say what the right content is, but here's an example from Patagonia. Yeah. So my Starbucks idea was a good example of this kind of engagement, where Starbucks invited as many customer ideas as possible and got around 150,000, really. But the point is to shift from broadcast conversation to dialogue, basically. And the more that you can move from a kind of telling perspective to a working with, the more chance you have of getting the right kind of message, basically. And you might be using tools like polls, question and answer sessions, pledges, feedback loops, consumer panels, and so on. And the more you use this kind of thing, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, and panels, I think, can be quite hard to run. So they could be set up on an ad hoc basis. But the more that you do this, the feedback that is, and dialogue, the more likely you are to get a positive response from your customers. Here's an example from Oatly, the plant milk people. They're doing phenomenally well, and it's partly because they've got this messaging which actually began to some extent with innocent drinks, but that it's got very positive framing. The idea is to match its style to what the audience wants to see. Is innocent, as I mentioned. They talk about being on a mission to become a good all-rounder, and they share their progress about their sustainability credentials with in this kind of newspaper format. So facts alone are cold, stories alone are a bit flimsy. So you've got to have the human in the story here. And Unilever's, in some ways, a very strong example of responsible communication. So this focusing on what resonates is important. Ben and Jerry's are famously good at this. They've been campaigning on social justice, even though they're owned by Unilever now. They've been campaigning on social justice for a long time and local community action. They make some mother chunking changes. Their message here, which is unusual, but they do have a really strong following, and the result of their environmental and community action has led them to be one of the world's biggest ice cream brands. So there are sets of do's and don'ts here. I won't go through them all because that will be tedious, but using personal stories is important rather than just relying on numbers and facts. You know, on energy saving, talk about the sense, the logic of using energy carefully, basically saving money, rather than stressing change or focusing on unfamiliar technologies. So in our white paper, we kind of bring all this together from looking, and credit to Alina in particular, bringing all this together suggests that responsible communication is best done when you frame messages in a positive, concrete way that speaks to a set of values that your company can credibly claim to have. So enablers, that's communication, of course, but you've got to have something real to communicate about. And so I think responsible communication arises from being sustainable in general. So a roadmap is to look at what you're doing at the moment. You've had a little bit of a think about it in this session, but really look at it properly over the course of the next 1 to 3 months. Audit your communications. Think about what formats you're currently using, and then put into place a different set of framing approaches along the lines of the principles that we've said, and ensure that when you communicate, you build some feedback loops so you can get some feedback on this, and then longer term, 12 months on, start to co-create that message with customers and embed the transparency, and hopefully that will help you achieve much more responsible, sustainable communications.